credibility problem here as well for Donald Trump, because he's made the promises on the campaign trail that he would pull the United States out of this Paris Accord, and then he has to U-turn if he decides to remain it. So how much do you think, in a sense, actually, that that's filtering into his decision as he's learning what the implications of leaving actually means?
Well, thanks for having me. I think that the credibility issues are probably less of an impediment to this president than perhaps any other in history. What he does have, though, is an intellectual consistency argument. Is he going to be engaged in the world as an activist at the table, projecting power, projecting economic might, or is he going to be withdrawing to a more passive posture? If anything, there's a consistency issue in the sense that he's just reasserted the United States on the world stage in several fora and would be then retreating were he to leave the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, I want to just sidestep from that, actually, and ask you, in terms of the Paris Accord itself, let's say he decides to take a step away and to exit. How can he actually do that? Is there a way for him to take a sidestep from the Paris Accord and go, actually, you know, we're not going to follow through on this anymore, but we can actually still comply with some elements of it? Can he soften the exit here, I guess, is what I'm asking, in your mind?
Oh, for sure. He has the ability to simply stand back and miss the targets that were proposed and ultimately finalized by the prior administration. The U.S. is on deck to reduce emissions below 2005 levels by between 26 and 28% by the year 2025. As it stands right now, the U.S. is not on track to meet those targets. Rolling back domestic regulations would make it even harder for the U.S. to meet those targets. And as a result, staying in the accord but failing to meet the targets would be a perfectly viable way of de facto renegotiating it, because other parties would be forced to cast the first stone. There are more explicit options, obviously, leaving the agreement itself, leaving the broader treaty of which it is part, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Both of those have time fuses. And so, essentially, Trump has optionality in all three options. He can choose to act immediately and still not commit that action directly until a later date. For a deal maker and a negotiator, that's a very, very good place to be.
It feels like leverage.
Yeah, and of course he's looking for leverage. He's a deal maker. So talk a little bit about that option where he has a lot of optionality. For instance, even if the U.S. were to leave the Paris Accord, it wouldn't be effective immediately. So what would happen between the time that the U.S. says it's going to leave and when it actually becomes effective?
Well, the Paris Agreement requires 3 years before you can even register your intent to leave, so November of 2019, and then a year before the departure is finalized. During that time, you can imagine that there'd be concessions the president might want to exact from counterparties. One of those is the interpretation of an article in the agreement that basically, in writing, it seems to say that we should be increasing, every participant should be increasing the ambition of their emissions reductions in subsequent iterations, but to recast that in a way that allows a flat to down performance to qualify. Another thing he might negotiate for could be to try to raise the targets of China and India and other emerging economies that are effectively staying the course where they are right now and meeting full compliance. By ratcheting up the requirements on those countries, Trump could argue that an America First agenda is actually increasing the competitiveness of the United States relative to other parties.
But do they hang fire? Do they continue to abide by the emissions targets if the United States leaves? Do you think China would see this as an opportunity to go, you know what, we're going to step into a leadership role, we are going to abide by these emission targets? Or do you think all the other countries slacken off and go, you know what, if the United States is going to churn out pollution, we'll do the same?
I hate to be the one to say there's much to do about nothing here, but the course of emissions reductions is driven by so many subnational targets and other economic and political goals. For China, pollution reductions would carry them on an emissions reduction course just anyway, even without the Paris Agreement in force. For other countries that were always going to miss their targets, they would still miss their targets even if the U.S. were to remain in it. Largely what the Paris Agreement did was establish a framework so that in subsequent iterations there could be a clampdown on countries that missed their targets. What this does, in effect, is it pushes back the date when those clampdowns might start to happen. But it wasn't going to bind, in all likelihood, for the better part of 5 years, maybe to a decade.
And this is